We began this project by pondering what kinds of polls would constitute a more universal approach to happiness rather than Western concepts of what constitutes happiness. For this reason, we chose to use data from the Gallup World Poll as a proxy for happiness. The poll posed the question to measure civic engagement within individual countries. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your freedom to choose what you do with your life? Although the question may sound Western oriented, it is actually a very universal approach to understanding if individuals are satisfied with the amount of freedom their individual governments give them. In other words, the Gallup World Poll hinges on a subjective measurement of satisfaction within specific countries. We hypothesized that a majority of people in almost all countries will be satisfied with the level of freedom they have within their country. After deciding to use the Gallup World Poll as a proxy for happiness, we wanted to understand what factors play into individuals' perceptions of lower or higher satisfaction with their freedom. We chose three factors: civil liberties, freedom of the press, and government effectiveness. Civil liberties is a measurement from Freedom House, which constitutes freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual rights. Freedom of the press is also a measurement from Freedom House. Freedom of the press evaluates legal environment from the media, political control over media, and readers' access to information. Government effectiveness is a measure from the World Bank which constitutes consideration for citizens in formulating and carrying out policy. We predicted that government effectiveness will be a better indicator of happiness than civil liberties because government effectiveness is a universal notion measured through subjective polling, while civil liberties are Western oriented and measured through objective comparative analysis. The results indicate our hypothesis to be correct. We started by evaluating the relationship between government effectiveness and happiness. On the x-axis is government effectiveness. The y-axis measures happiness through citizen satisfaction with freedom. Each dot represents an individual country, with 139 countries represented on the chart. The correlation coefficient indicates that there was little correlation between government effectiveness and happiness. On the next graph, the x-axis is civil liberties and the y-axis is happiness. The correlation coefficient proves that civil liberties are 50% less correlated to happiness than government effectiveness. However, both government effectiveness and civil liberties are poor indicators of a country's happiness. As the graph shows, after comparing civil liberties to government effectiveness, a relatively strong correlation between the two becomes evident. The x-axis shows civil liberties, whereas the y-axis shows government effectiveness. Even though they share a correlation, neither of them, together or apart, are very strong indicators of happiness. Just like government effectiveness and civil liberties by themselves are poor indicators of happiness, freedom of the press alone is a terrible indicator of happiness. This is represented by the correlation coefficient of 0.009. Next, we set out to establish a relationship between freedom of the press and its umbrella parent, civil liberties. We found while there is some correlation between freedom of the press and civil liberties, their relationship is not dependent. Recognizing this, we decided to evaluate how presence or absence of freedom of the press affects a country's happiness. Evaluating freedom of the press separately allows us to gauge whether or not the citizens of a country have access to information about governmental institutions, both inside and outside their countries. Map number 1 shows a wide array of effective and ineffective governments, effective governments with and without civil liberties, and ineffective governments with and without civil liberties. Upon first glance, the West seems effective and free, while Asia and Africa appear ineffective and not free. Map number 2 shows that despite these differences, almost every country in the world is a happy country. In fact, only 8 of the 138 countries that are pictured are sad. But what makes those 8 countries sad? Upon combining the two maps, we find that the relationship lies not between effectiveness and civil liberties, but among effectiveness, civil liberties, and freedom of the press. No country that has high government effectiveness, civil liberties, and freedom of the press is sad. Countries with ineffective governments, few civil liberties, and freedom of the press are sad. This is most likely because citizens within these countries can compare their perceptions of freedom to other countries' perceptions of freedom and understand that they have other options. Countries with ineffective governments, few civil liberties, and little freedom of the press are happy because they know of nothing better than what they have in their countries. In other words, restricted freedom of the press inhibits their ability to compare their perceptions of freedom to other countries' perceptions of freedom and prevents them from understanding that they have other options. We found that our hypothesis is true. A majority of people in almost all countries are satisfied with the level of freedom they have within their country. Our prediction that government effectiveness is a stronger indicator of happiness than civil liberties is also true. While our prediction was true, research proved that the best indicator of happiness comes from not just government effectiveness, but through combining government effectiveness with civil liberties and freedom of the press.